Good evening. My name is Brian Liddy, and welcome to Scotland at 7 here at Broadcasting Scotland. Tonight we've got as a guest Siobhan Tolland. Siobhan, welcome. Siobhan's a regular
Thank you.
contributor, and it's great to have you here. As usual, we'll start tonight's programme with the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 2,536,071 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,180,683 have been confirmed negative. 355,338 people have tested positive. There are 841 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test today, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There have been no new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 7,992. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 356 were in hospital last night, 42 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,026,827 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,342,056 people had received their second dose. Latest UK daily figures up until yesterday show 130,357 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 37 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. So for our first story, we'd like to say that Scotland has moved to beyond level 0, with nightclubs opening at midnight for the first time since the start of the pandemic. The legal requirement for social distancing in bars and other hospitality venues is eased, which means they can now open fully, although the requirement for some protections means that some restrictions remain in place elsewhere. The successful vaccine rollout in Scotland has seen case numbers, hospitalisations and the number of deaths falling, as this has given the Scottish Government the confidence to move ahead with the relaxation of restrictions. Deputy First Minister John Swinney cautioned that some protections could continue, perhaps voluntarily, until 2022. However, he welcomed the relaxation of restrictions, saying that the summer period is an opportunity for people to spend time outdoors. Restrictions which remain are face coverings still need to be worn indoors in public places, such as shops and on public transport. School staff must keep at least 1 metre distant from each other and from children and young people. Pupils and teachers must wear masks indoors for up to 6 weeks after school's return. Office workers should still work from home where possible, and 2 metre distancing should still be observed in healthcare settings. Meanwhile, details still need to be given at hospitality venues for the test and protect system. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's new report begins today. Oh, forgive me, I've just forgot to
You forgot me.
to bring in. Once I get started, Siobhan. The First Minister has had her first jab, and Neil Oliver, meanwhile, is denying his children the vaccine. Also, clubbers now have somewhere to go and dance after over a year. So progress is being made, but the pandemic isn't done with us yet, is it? So today, for example, on the way here, I saw that there were Perspex screens being sort of taken out of cafes and bars and being put on the pavement. I'm assuming that they're probably going to be skipped. But do you think, is it too soon to skip things like that, or should they be kept in storage a little bit longer, do you think?
I mean, the Perspex screens are slightly controversial in that, Independence Age talks about because it's airborne, it doesn't really give much protection anyway. But yeah, I get your point. I think that, I mean, from what I saw just from my own observations today, I was out about in kind of Tesco and Dunelm and stuff, and there were still the screens. There was lots of people wearing masks. We still had to observe the social distancing. The test and trace was very much still in action as well. It seemed it kind of, because it's not often I go out, if I'm honest, but it struck me today that it's just become a bit of a well-oiled machine now. Is that we're all kind of used to that process, and it would be good for me, I think, and just that sense of self-protection, like you were saying, to maybe just keep some of those processes for the meantime, just to make us feel safe and secure as well. I mean, today's statistics has shown that we're sitting at 6.7%, which is, we're getting there towards the under 5%, which is obviously the World Health Organization percentage. Was under 5 is considered the pandemic being under control. So Scotland's kind of moving towards that at the moment, although it was completely out of control just a month or so ago. So we are making, like you say, massive progress. It's interesting because I don't know about you guys, but psychologically, the work that I do, we're beginning to think in terms of COVID recovery now, and how we rebuild our communities and how we begin to process the experiences that we've had. So there is a sense that we've kind of crossed over that, that kind of summit almost, and maybe moving forward towards a kind of bit of a recovery. That's in Scotland and maybe the Western world at best, though across the globe, the COVID pandemic is still raging quite significantly. And so we have to kind of put that in context that, I've said it so many times, but we're not safe until everybody's safe. So we may feel slightly safe and cocooned at this moment in time, but we know from previous experience, as soon as we begin to feel safe, then suddenly something changes, and it can all change overnight. I mean, we've experienced that quite a few times now. So as soon as we can, we need to get it globally under control before we can all feel genuinely safe, I think.
Thank you. Which ties in quite nicely with the First Minister has asked us to continue to take sensible precautions, was the expression that she used.
Yeah.
And it seems that she would agree with you that it would be a shame to put the progress that we have made at risk. As you say, we're not safe until we're all safe. Do you think we will take sensible precautions, or will people get too...
I mean, no secret, but a big fan of Professor Reicher, from a social psychologist from St Andrews University, and some of the research and talks that he's been given is a very positive outlook of society's response to the COVID pandemic. That we took considerable. We took actions that were considerably at our expense for the sake of other people. And one of the things that we did do very, very early on in the pandemic was literally do that. We sacrificed our own freedoms for the sake of other people. So, in a positive outlook, yes, I think we will. I think that people recognise the need for collective self-awareness here, and we've shown that we've done that. There's always exceptions. There's always going to be, at the fringes of society where, there's little care or consideration. But in the main, most people did sacrifice their own well-being for the greater good of others. And I say that a lot, but as a shield, I'm very grateful for those sacrifices that people made to make me feel safe and others feel safe. So I'm an optimist by nature, and I think that Professor Reicher's research is optimistic by nature as well. I do think that people will do the right thing and think collectively in terms of our well-being. That is maybe the psychological shift that's happened over COVID, is that we've recognised that need for collective well-being much more now. So yeah, I'm hopeful, actually.
Great. Thank you for that, Siobhan. So moving on to the next story, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's new report begins with the statement that it is unequivocal that the climate crisis has been caused by human activities and is already affecting every corner of the planet's land, air and sea. The report, produced by hundreds of the world's top scientists and signed off by all the world's governments, concludes that it could get far worse if the slim chance remaining to avert heating above 1.5 degrees Celsius is not immediately grasped. We have already caused 1.1 degrees Celsius rising on global warming, getting perilously close to the 1.5 degree danger limit agreed in the Paris climate deal. Downpours of rain have been accelerating since the 1980s. Accelerated melting of ice has poured trillions of tons of water into the oceans, where oxygen levels are falling and acidity is rising. Sea level has already risen by 20 centimetres. Greenhouse gas emission by fossil fuel burning, forest destruction and other human activities are now clearly destabilising the mild climate in which civilization began, the report shows. Carbon dioxide levels in the air are now at their highest for the last 2 million years. Some heating is already inevitable. We will definitely hit 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 2 decades, whatever happens to emissions, the IPCC has found. The only good news is that the keeping of 1.5 degrees is not yet impossible. If emissions do not fall in the next couple of decades, then a rise of 3 degrees looks likely, which would be catastrophic. And if they don't fall at all, the report says, then we are on track for a 4 to 5 degree rise in temperatures, which would be global apocalypse territory. The report is clear there are no cliff edges to the climate crisis. Each tonne of carbon pumped out increases the impact and risks of extreme heat, floods and droughts, and so every tonne of carbon matters. It will never be too late to act, but the real question is how bad does it have to get before change happens? The many scientific advances since the last comprehensive IPCC report in 2013 means better projections for specific regions of the world. It finds nowhere is safe. For example, even at 1.5 degrees of heating, heavy rain and flooding are projected to intensify in Europe, North America and most regions of Africa and Asia. The report is the 6th by the IPCC, but is the first to thoroughly assess the risk of tipping points. Tipping points are abrupt and irreversible changes to crucial Earth systems that have huge impacts and are of increasing concern to scientists. The report warns that the collapse of major Atlantic currents, ice caps completely melting, or the Amazon rainforest being totally wiped out cannot be ruled out. The final section of the IPCC report addresses how future climate change can be limited. It finds that 2,400 billion tonnes of CO2 have been emitted by humanity since the year 1850, and we can only afford to leak another 400 billion tonnes to have a 66% chance of keeping to the 1.5 degree target. The scientists have now spoken, louder and clearer than ever before. Now it is for politicians and policymakers to act. Siobhan, I'm just going to list key points that came out of the IPCC report today to give you an idea of the sort of things that they're talking about. They say clearly humans are to blame, full stop. Mm-hmm. Temperatures will keep rising. Weather is getting extreme. Arctic summers could soon be free of ice. Seas will rise no matter what, and we are running out of time. Do we need a global response to climate change, something on the scale of COVID? And if so, what would that look like? Would it mean no international travel, no private car ownership, that being outlawed, or even things like ban ironing? And I'm actually serious when I say ban ironing. It might sound funny, but just think about how if this is going to. We need to make major changes to people's lifestyle. So how bad do you think does it have to get before people will comply?
I think that there's two levels here that I I'm not so keen on the philosophy that we all take an individual responsibility. Don't get me wrong, I think we do, but it needs much, much more than each individual taking responsibility and not doing a bit less ironing and doing the recycling, etc., etc. This needs a much more sophisticated, much more strategic, much more intergovernmental approach, as you said, and it needs to encourage individuals and make it worthwhile for change. It needs to give us that encouragement. We need to we need to stop the exploration of oil fields. Full stop. We need to do that. I think immediately now. The United Nations Director General said that this is now code red. This is serious. This is like you say. We're reaching a tipping point. So that's the first thing I think we should do. We need to absolutely start. If we think about COVID, and if we think about something like Yanis Varoufakis was saying a wee while ago about how the fact that we were like just across the globe just printing money in order to keep ourselves afloat during the COVID pandemic, well, we need to do something similar. We need to do kind of like a quantitative easing approach so we can start investing in as much eco-friendly energy sources as we can. Scotland has made a good start, but there's some kind of controversy there over the Cambo oil field and so forth as well. So there really needs to be massive, massive intergovernmental global investment in green energy in an attempt to immediately replace fossil fuels, because that's one of the biggest carbon emissions and one of the biggest methane emissions as well, isn't it? And that's what's causing some of the warming as well. Some things are irreversible now, and there's nothing that we can do about this, but we can halt the damage and we can stop the damage, but it requires a massive undertaking, and it does require actually massive sacrifices from each individual nation as well as individuals. And I get your point about that, but it requires much more governmental sacrifices, I think. In the same way, if we think about 1945, and this is maybe a bit of a kind of small scale example, but if we think about the 1945 government that invested in health and well-being and the social security system, what they did is they pumped money and invested in an infrastructure that supported that kind of health and well-being. We need to work on the level of sustained investment, but for an ecological and global transition of how our infrastructure works. It's that level of radicalism now. It's that level of out-of-the-box thinking that we're now going to need, and it needs to be done now. The biggest disappointment that we're going to get from COP26 is if we get the same old okay, we're going to do it, and then everybody goes back and pretends that that nothing's going to happen, or pretends that we're going to do something and then nothing does. It needs to be action. It's going to be a really, really interesting November here in Glasgow, because we've had our own problems with flooding in Glasgow over the weekend, haven't we? So it's coming right on our doorsteps now, and we've got Boris Johnson basically, trying to ignore trying to ignore the dangers of further oil exploration as well. We've got Nicola Sturgeon actually sitting on the fence a wee bit there too, which is slightly concerning. So we really, really need to take those kind of large scale structural investment in order to make sure that we do this quickly now. Time is of the essence. I feel like the IPCC report is a bit like the comet coming to the dinosaurs. This is our warning. It's there on the horizon now, and we really need to make sure that we get it sorted. It's if COVID has taught us anything, and it's taught us quite a lot, is that global, like you said, global cooperation is absolutely vital. We know that we can do it because we've done it to a relatively large degree with COVID, but it's that kind of cooperation times 10, and it needs to be done immediately.
Thank you. Earlier in the report, the Paris Climate Agreement was mentioned. That was back in 2015, Siobhan. Almost every nation on the planet signed up to that. And that's where the famous 1.5 degrees net zero that we keep hearing, that came out of that agreement. So we certainly have been warned before today, and later on this year, as you said, there's going to be COP26 here in Glasgow. The Prime Minister and his cabinet, they've all taken to the airwaves today to say that this is a decisive wake-up call. But doesn't that beg the question that why have they been asleep on this?
I mean, there's a million different reasons. I think it's even. I mean, even on an individual level, me and my friend were speaking about that earlier on. Nobody likes to admit that the world's in danger. It's quite a significant thing to psychologically have to deal with. But I think what we've got is, if you look at Westminster, and if you look at the Donald Trump government and the damage that those 4 years did in terms of the environment coming out, the Paris Agreement and all those kind of things, and Biden trying to just clear up that mess now. What you had was almost the crescendo of a neoliberal economic model where basically profit came first, foremost, and last. Nothing else mattered. This was the economic model that kind of seems to have dominated across the airways since 1979. The model was pretty much nothing else mattered apart from the kind of profits of the shareholders, and the economic system worked according to that model. The social model of kind of welfareism kind of dissipated across the globe as well. The UK, if you look at Brexit, part of the reason Brexit came on the board, because those social understandings, the social kind of welfare model that we kind of set up in 1945 was no longer considered needed, because it interfered with the economic model that the Brexit government was trying to push forward. It made us look very narrowly towards, and nothing else mattered but profit. If you have a system where nothing else matters except for profit, then everything else goes to the dogs. And that narrow economic structure, and what it did was basically allow everything else to be considered last place in the kind of global structure. That was environment, that was health and well-being, that was humanity almost, that was human rights. Everything else kind of came second. And that narrow economic model, that's what Westminster's been pushing for the last kind of 20, 30 years since Thatcher came on board. That is probably the biggest the single biggest attack on our kind of rights and on the ecological structures that we've had. It's been incredibly damaging, but it's that narrow focus, and it's that economic model that we have to now change. And there is changes being made. Of course there is. I think the COVID again has kind of brought those issues to the fore. Much more of a kind of social welfare model, the well-being economy is something that's been promoted across New Zealand, Iceland, as well as Scotland, because what that means is it's not just about profit, it's not just about how much we make, it's about the health and well-being of the planet as well as people. It's that model that needs changed, and it's that kind of that's where wake-up call. Because if we continue, we can say, I mean, COP26, right, they can go home and governments can say, yeah, we're going to do it. But if they continue the model of economics where profit takes first and foremost precedence in everything they do, we will never get any further forward in terms of tackling climate change. This is the core, isn't it? Because we reset the economy to make sure that the environment and people are served first. Profit last, people and environment first. That's the massive economic and social change that needs to occur.
That's great. Thank you, Siobhan. And on a similar vein, Scotland has been catapulted to the top of the tables in Europe for countries who produce electricity from renewables. The latest figures available place Scotland in the top three. Scottish Government figures for 2020 show 97% of electricity in Scotland is now produced from renewables. When compared with the latest data from Eurostat for 2019, it takes Scotland into the top three of nations in Europe producing clean electricity. In 2019, only Norway and Iceland produced more electricity from renewables than Scotland. Other nations behind Scotland in the table include Sweden, Denmark and Germany. It also puts Scotland way ahead of the UK as a whole, which produces just 35% of electricity from renewables. So, Siobhan, this is a good news story, isn't it? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it is a good news story. I mean, there's still so much more to do, and go back to the Campbell oil field here. It's like we can produce as much renewable energy as we want, but if we keep digging for oil, then we've got ourselves a bigger problem that we might not be able to resolve. But yes, it is a good news story, and it takes, I think, for me, it takes me back to it's accelerating that now, isn't it? It's removing the gas central heating systems in houses. It's kind of creating new build houses with solar energy and so forth. And just going to say a wee local story. I live in a wee kind of village outside Dundee, and there is quite how shall I put it, a negative response to a large solar farm that's been built just down the road, or proposed to be built just down the road. And there is a tension there. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier on about individual responsibility. And me and my son were talking about this, and it's like, how much do we want renewable energy, and how much do we want a kind of better ecological system if we don't want it in our neighbourhood? There's a wee bit of a NIMBY thing here, not on my backyard. Do you remember that kind of saying? And so it's kind of the response from my village, I think, is disappointing, because what we're having is the sense of, yeah, it's a good idea, but let's not do it here. Well, where do we do it? So we have to increase the level of these kind of environmentally friendly energy sources. We have to, I mean, the SNP government are making, I think, a really good start, where you're talking about, good social housing building, which is really important because it can provide cheaper, warmer houses, but also introduce better heating systems. But we need to do that, I think, on a larger scale. There's all these kind of processes that the SNP's made a start on that can increase our kind of ecological kind of structures and make them much more environmentally friendly. But I think, given the IPCC report, it kind of creates a much more stronger sense of urgency now in how we get that done and how we kind of take those initiatives forward. It's a good start, but it needs to go at a bit more a rapid pace now. So it is a good news story. And, I went to Iceland just before lockdown, and it's amazing to see their geothermal energy structure and the kind of cheapness of their energy and stuff as well. And it's pretty cool. And it's very cool that we're up there with Iceland and Norway. If we become independent, when we become independent, we can maybe fly a lot more in pushing those structures a bit better and make much more investment. We need to do in Scotland what I said, globally all countries have to do. We have to invest in our infrastructure and make it much more environmentally friendly, and invest in renewables to a degree by which we've probably not quite imagined possible yet, but it needs to be done. So it is a good news story, but lots more to do.
That's great. Thank you, Siobhan. So moving on, Boris Johnson has full confidence in Rishi Sunak, his spokesman has said, but he would not deny that the Prime Minister threatened to demote his Chancellor. After reports of tensions, the Number 10 spokesman said, "The Prime Minister and the Chancellor have always enjoyed a close and effective working relationship and will continue to do so." However, he did not deny that Johnson had floated the idea of demoting Sunak to Health Secretary after a letter from the Chancellor calling for COVID travel restrictions to be lifted was leaked last week. Johnson is reported to have been furious about the leak, partly because he largely shared Sunak's position on the need to relax restrictions. The letter, which made its way into the hands of the Sunday Times, was pitched as an unprecedented intervention to persuade the Prime Minister to change the UK's quarantine policy. Johnson brought in Sunak after a rift with the former Chancellor Sajid Javid, but since then relations have soured, with the Chancellor now appearing to be more popular with grassroots Conservatives than the Prime Minister. So, Siobhan, how much of this do you think is down to Boris Johnson seeing this as a popularity competition?
It's all very Shakespearean, isn't it? It's like power struggles right, left, and centre. I think Boris Johnson I think he just sees everything as a popularity contest. I think his understanding of political kind of business seems to not go into any more depth than what's popular for him. And I also think that Boris Johnson only really trusts Boris Johnson as well, and he's the perfect opportunist as well. He will just use and abuse whatever is necessary in order to kind of reach his goal. It's an interesting one. I hate to gloat, but it's always nice to see the Conservative government in a bit of a mess and a bit of turmoil. We always kind of have a tendency to see them as quite united, but the divisions are very much shown through, increasingly so of late. And what you're taught, it feels a wee bit like the last man standing, doesn't it? You've got these kind of like people vying for power. You've always got Gove in the background, kind of lurking around like some kind of, I don't know, some kind of theatre baddie figure or something, waiting to take power. But there really is a kind of, it looks like there's a kind of struggle between what, two or three individuals all vying for power now. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But you know what? It's nice to see them fighting, and a divided Westminster government is maybe a good thing for us, because we are, by comparison, incredibly united in our goal, moving towards independence. And it's much easier to it's much easier to get a debate against a divided government than a united one.
Thanks for that, Siobhan. So for the next story, new analysis from the House of Commons Library shows Brexit is costing the whisky industry £5 million per week. UK exports of whiskies to the EU were £105 million lower in January to May 2021 than in January-May 2019, which on average is a loss of £5 million per week. In the immediate aftermath of Brexit from January to March 2021, the whisky industry saw its exports drop to £136 million lower than in the same period in 2019. Which works out at an average of £10.4 million a week lower. In 2019, Scotch whisky accounted for 75% of all Scottish food and drink exports, 21% of all UK food and drink exports, and 1.4% of all UK goods exports. Commenting, SNP MP for Argyll and Bute Brendan O'Hara said, Scotch whisky plays a crucial role in the success of Scotland's food and drink sector and our economy, given its accounts for 75% of the sector. So for the industry to be losing £5 million per week is devastating. Siobhan, we didn't hear very much from the whisky industry before the Brexit referendum about any potential losses to their sector. Do you think they should have spoken up at the time?
I mean, the industry statement for the moment is a lot more reticent than the SNP statement. They're kind of making out that they're slightly less concerned. Whether that's wishful thinking or not is maybe another issue. But I do think that there's problems here, isn't it? I mean, this is a massive industry for Scotland. It would be nice for the whisky industry to kind of really give an honest outlook here as to what is going on. I mean, if those figures are true, and why would they not be, because it's come from, the House of Commons Library, if those figures are true, then we really are in a lot of trouble in terms of our food and drink industry, and the whisky industry maybe needs to kind of take a wee bit of control here and say, like, come on, what's going on? We need to push forward and try and reverse some of the damage. As the SNP kind of said, this is damage that we never voted for, we never asked for, we demanded against, and yet it's happening anyway. It really is something that it's utterly painful to watch, I think, as an observer of, and someone who lives in Scotland. We're experiencing events that we've got very little control over now, and that's Brexit as well as COVID. We've had very little control over all those bad things that seem to be happening to our country over the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years. It's time to take that control, isn't it? And it's time to kind of make our own decisions here. But yes, I think it would be nice to get a bit more from the whisky industry. Their statement was slightly vague, if I'm honest, less vague than maybe the Westminster government statement, who kind of fudged all the figures a wee bit. But it's a huge industry, and it's, I mean, we spoke about this on a previous programme, but food and drink is a large brand for Scotland, whisky especially so. So it's something that we really do need to push forwards. And it's something that we should be building on in order to kind of, you know, in order to revitalise our economy across the board. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah,
I,
that's great.
we'll
Yeah,
see what happens.
absolutely. That's all we can do, really, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you, Siobhan. So the next story is the Taliban have claimed a huge symbolic victory after their fighters seized a large city for the first time in northern Afghanistan as part of a seemingly unstoppable offensive in which they have captured 5 provincial capitals in just 3 days. Armed men swept into Kunduz on Sunday, a strategic city close to the border with Tajikistan and is an important political and military hub. By morning, they controlled the city centre while pro-government forces retreated to the nearby airport. Residents fled as smoke from the city's burning market engulfed the sky. Videos posted by Taliban fighters showed the city's abandoned police compound, complete with cars and its main security and intelligence buildings intact. The Taliban spokesperson, Zabihullah Mujahid, tweeted, "The enemy left behind vehicles, weapons, and equipment," and he promised further advances. Siobhan, apart from the obvious cost, and when you have a conflict like this, in which Britain and America were involved, there's a wider human cost to this in terms of the Taliban and how they organised Afghanistan society and how that impacts on the likes of women's rights. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, firstly, I'm just going to say spare a thought for the 27 kids that have been killed over the last few days. It's not a safe place for kids at the best of times, but this is making it particularly difficult. And no matter what we think of the politics, kids are always going to be victims of a process. And they are the ones we need to protect the most, and they're the ones who will always be the most innocent in any conflict. So just say that. But in terms of women's rights, yeah, it's. I was just reading up some stuff on Amnesty International and what the Taliban's kind of philosophy on women are. It is an incredibly suppressive regime structure for women. I mean, we are talking about you can't leave the house without a burqa. You can't leave a house without a man. There was one, they were kind of, what was it, banning women from accessing healthcare that was delivered by men, but of course women were forbidden from working. So effectively, you had this kind of vicious cycle where women really had struggled to get any healthcare. We had, women weren't allowed to get involved in politics. They weren't allowed to show their skin in public. There really is a kind of deep suppression of women from the Taliban structures, and that is deeply concerning from a kind of gendered and a feminist perspective as well. It's all really quite a bit depressing because it feels like we've just went right back to where we started back in 2001. The Taliban looks like they're going to be successful in overtaking Afghanistan. Symbolically, they've just took a city that was their power base back before the US and the UK invaded. So they really are they're building momentum in terms of kind of trying to take over. So we could be seeing the kind of reintroduction of the Taliban. It's quite a depressing situation. I get Biden's philosophy here because we should never have invaded in the first place, because we went in under false pretexts, in terms of kind of the 9/11 attacks and so forth. So, but at the same time, it feels a wee bit like, going into somebody's house, trashing the whole house, then walking away and going, right, there you go, there's your mess, but it's nothing to do with us anymore. So there really is a kind of sense of we can't, do we really just withdraw and leave that mess that we caused? So we'll have to take some kind of moral and ethical responsibility here, I think. And the Taliban, even just looking at women's rights, particularly brutal regime in that respect. It's been spoken about quite a few times on the show and further abroad as well. But this is what happens when the West start intervening in these situations. We go in, we think we know what's best. We went in there to serve our own vested purposes, and we didn't really care about the consequences to the people, the women, the kids in Afghanistan. And then we've kind of withdrawn and says, right, well, that's it. We've made a mess of it, but we've done what we needed to do. So let's let you guys get on with it. And now the Taliban are running roughshod across the nation, and probably galvanised in an anti-US and anti-Western structure, because you know what? We went in and we invaded. So why wouldn't people feel anti-Western in that respect? It's probably a kind of relatively sensible response given the circumstances, but it fuels terrorist organisations, and that's what it often does. That's what the West often does. They go in with the heavy jack boots and they tend to kind of just cause discontent and fuel some of the kind of more violent terrorist organisations, because there's a kind of sense of gross injustice happening there. Again, the solutions for that, I have absolutely no idea. I hope we can halt the Taliban's progress, but it's not looking hopeful. And this is an optimist speaking here. It's not looking hopeful. I think we need a global, integrated, and real sustained response here, to support kind of the democratically elected structures that exist within Afghanistan, and promote women's rights across the board. Use the human rights and use the women's rights as a way of trying to tackle the injustices that's happening within the Taliban. Because if the Taliban gain power again, then women will step back almost centuries, it'll feel like, for women's rights there. It's a very, very difficult situation, and we have to take responsibility for our role in that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Siobhan. As you say, it's a complicated situation to say the least, and thank you for that timely reminder about how young people and women always seem to pay the price. So moving on, a consultation has been launched to seek the public's views ahead of the creation of a national care service, which will ensure everyone who needs it can expect the same standards of care wherever they live in Scotland. The National Care Service will deliver person-centred care that supports people in a way that suits their needs, providing real benefits for those who are being cared for and the people who care for them. It will introduce ethical commissioning based on fair work principles for the benefit of everyone involved. The consultation sets out some of the options for delivering social care in a way which changes the system from one that supports people to survive to one that empowers them to thrive. It recognises that this will involve significant cultural and system change that will need to be supported by new laws and new ways of working. In order to deliver these recommendations, promises have been made of strong local accountability. The consultation proposes community health and social care boards to strengthen the voice of the local population, meaning people with actual lived experience together with local elected members sitting alongside professionals. Consulting on the proposals was one of the commitments for the first 100 days of this SNP government, while implementation of the recommendations of the Independent Review of Social Adult Care and the establishment of a National Care Service will be one of the most significant tasks of the current Parliament. So Siobhan, there's mention there of including people with actual real lived experience sitting alongside professional experts. Do you agree that folk with real lived experiences should always sit alongside what would normally be called professional experts on a delivery of a project like this one?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, I think that Jean Freeman and her, her quite innovative work with the Social Security Service kind of created the path towards that, wasn't it? It was about, she heavily involved people with their lived experience of the Social Security system, and it was from that experience that was built the new Social Security system. So we've got a kind of, that's kind of set a precedence in how we work. I think, an amazingly kind of democratic way and innovative way of working in that respect. How do we build a service without and that's the question, isn't it? How did we do it before? How do we build a service like that without the input of people whose lived experience is through that system? So yes, absolutely. I am going to note that COSLA is quite concerned over some of the issues that the consultation has kind of raised. One of the things that Kevin Stewart has been talking about is that the initial recommendation, the report's recommendation last year was that a national care service be set up for older people. But actually, what is now on the cards, or potentially on the cards, is that lots of people can become part of this national care service, the social services, younger people, care experienced people, and so forth. So that sense of a national care service would span all ages. COSLA's concern is that will de-democratise local government. That I think they're concerned about that standardised process, that it might lead to a centralisation. I'm not sure. I mean, I've not read the report or in any great detail, but I do think there's maybe a slight misunderstanding of where that is. For me, it seemed to be trying to improve local democracy at a local level. I think a standardised approach doesn't necessarily mean taking away localisation as such, but I hope we find that balance that keeps COSLA, because COSLA is obviously the body for local government, that keep COSLA happy in terms of local intervention and local autonomy, but have a standardised approach across the board as well. I would love to see a national care service for all ages. I think that would be truly radical and truly innovative, because it could help us. It comes back to what we were saying earlier on about, health and well-being first. That's, if we can bring that under the remit of government democracy, local democracy, as well as Scottish government democracy, then we can revitalise that process and put people first. And that's what we want, rather than kind of creating systems that seeped into kind of privatisation along the road. We take it back into government hands and democratic hands. And that does involve, as you say, that involves people who use that service, who will benefit from that service. And I noticed that Kevin Stewart was quite keen on involving unpaid carers as well, because we often forget this. We recognise this during COVID. We work on, our society works on the back of a lot of unpaid carers. They are an infrastructure that has been massively undervalued and unpaid. So we need their input, and we need to kind of treat that part of the system with the respect that it deserves as well. I think it's really exciting. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into what COSLA's concerns is, because I think that we need to kind of keep COSLA on board. We need to make sure that local government's happy and comfortable with the new things that are taken forward. But I'm actually really excited by this process. Actually, the fact that it's built on a principle of fair wage as well means that what we've got from the other level, not just about care, but we begin to set up a system where good pay becomes part of that process as well. We know that the care sector is notoriously underpaid. It's a thing we do have to change, and it's again a thing that COVID has shown us quite clearly, that again we survived on those carers. They did a lot of the work, the dangerous work, the incredibly hard work that needed to be done in a time of crisis. And so that needs to be reviewed, and to build in the fair wage structure into that is another way forward. So it has multiple benefits across society, not just about the care for our older people or the people we need to look after, but the workforce that we also need to look after now as well.
Great. Thank you for that, Siobhan. So the next story is projects aiming to help transform towns and neighbourhoods can apply to a new £10 million multi-year fund. The Scotland Loves Local Fund aims to encourage people to think local first and support businesses and enterprises in their own community. The fund will provide match funding of between £5,000 and £25,000 for projects run by groups like town centre partnerships, chambers of commerce or community and charity trusts. Administered by Scotland's Towns Partnership, it aims to bring new, suitable, creative projects and activity to towns and neighbourhoods, helping to build local wealth and increase footfall while supporting local enterprise partnerships. Eligible projects could include things like community shops, marketing and digital schemes, or enabling larger construction projects delivery. So, Siobhan, do you think this kind of initiative by the Scottish Government is going to be the tonic that communities need after the stress of both Brexit and the pandemic? Or would you say it's a waste of public money?
I wouldn't say it's a waste of public money. I mean, I think it's maybe just a wee bit of a sticking plaster, but I certainly wouldn't say it was a waste of public money. I think that, I mean, if I think of my kind of closest village, which is in Dundee, and the decline of the town centre has been an issue that's been of concern for many years, and COVID has just exacerbated that. There are local community attempts now to revitalise that. There's some great street artwork, and that kind of sense of kind of building community hubs, community shops, and so forth that can be of benefit to the community, as well as the infrastructure and the shops and so forth as well, could potentially kind of have a massively positive impact. I just don't think that on its own it's going to have a huge impact. I think it needs to be part of a bigger infrastructure and economic process. If people don't have money to spend in the shops, then there's not much point in having a city. You know what I mean? There's not much point in having a centre if nobody's got any money to go and spend in it anyway. But it's about kind of, there's a sense of kind of your local kind of communities, or your local shops, or your local centres and so forth. There's a sense that we need to rebuild those communities now, because we've all become locked in our houses. We've all kind of dissipated from gathering together by necessity. So any attempt, I think, to revitalise the town centres and revitalise the shops and the community hubs and so forth is got to be worth the investment. I think it's got to be worth a try. Because we have to begin to do that now, because we've never been so isolated, and we've come from 18 months of deep isolation. We've kind of lost our social skills as well on a very fundamental level, but we need to start revitalising the community. I think that the plan is that they're going to give 50% of funding, so if you've got a project, they'll fund 50% of it, which is actually quite good, and I think it's between 5,000 and 25,000, so relatively small projects to kind of relatively medium-sized project as well. So with my community activist hat on, I'm thinking, well, could we do this? Could we do that? What is it that we can do that's community based, that can, for me, that's what I would be wanting to do, is to begin to find ways to look for funding through that process, is to kind of bring the communities together and help us process the events and move forward. That's certainly some of the projects we're looking at the moment. So yes, no, not at all a waste of money. We need to be quite innovative in how we move forward now, to rebuild our communities.
That's great. Thank you, Siobhan. So on to the next story, our final story, actually. Targeted funding to recruit 1,000 new teachers and 500 pupil support assistants in the next academic year has been announced by Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville. The additional £50 million will support COVID-19 education recovery as schools return to full-time face-to-face learning. The announcement meets another commitment for the first 100 days of this government. In addition, £65.5 million permanent funding will be allocated annually to councils from 2022 to 2023. The aim is to help remove barriers to councils employing these additional staff on permanent contracts and meet the local needs of children and young people. So, Siobhan, earlier on you mentioned COSLA and how it is important that we don't forget about them and keep them in the loop. Does COSLA have anything to say about this announcement, about local councils and funding for schools post-COVID?
Not that I've seen, to be honest, but I could be wrong on that. It's a good start, isn't it? I was just doing a bit quick of a mental calculation there, but if you look at kind of the amount of local authority areas that we've got, it's only something like 46 teachers and assistants per local authority area. If you do a crude calculation there, so it's not a massive input, but it's better than not. And we have had an increase of teachers early on as well. We certainly have a better ratio than the rest of the UK as well, although we maybe shouldn't have grade on a curve in that respect. but it is, again, it's a good start. And I think that it's that kind of area that we can always use more teachers. I think that what it probably could do, and what I would like maybe those extra teachers to do, is help the kids catch up. There will be disparities in how kids have been affected over the last 18 months. I know from my son's experience, he was in, he was out, he was in, he was out. My son's very lucky in that he's at a very good school. He's also kind of, he's got the privilege of having his own computer, his own room, his own internet access, support when he needs it. Not all kids have had that. I've only got one kid. I was able to give him the time that he needed, but you got 4 kids and you're all vying for the one laptop. Then there's disparities in how kids fell behind during COVID, and I would like to see that kind of teacher support used to help bridge that gap and help the more disadvantaged kids catch up. And hopefully, and I think that was the basis from which the decision was made anyway. So hopefully it will make a difference. If not a massive difference, because it's not going to be a massive onslaught on new teachers. But what I did notice is that they're looking to make those increases permanent. So I think it's something like, is it 16.5 million per year afterwards to keep those positions permanently. So that's a good thing, and hopefully that will kind of just bridge that gap a wee bit more.
Thank you, Siobhan. So that brings us to the end of tonight's news stories. So I'd just like to say once again, thank you, Siobhan, for your insight and contributions and for spending time with us again. Everybody at home, I hope that you enjoyed the show, and as usual, we'll end by saying that we can't do anything here without your help. If you are already someone who donates to our crowdfunder, then we say thank you. If you don't already donate, then perhaps you'd like to consider, so that we can continue to produce these programs. If that's not possible, then maybe you might like to volunteer. So you'll be seeing the addresses on the screen below us for the crowdfunder and for our website where you can contact us by. So thank you and good night, and we'll see you all again soon.